Picture this: a sunny afternoon at a quiet park, families enjoying their time, kids laughing, and everything seems perfect, until an entitled Karen shows up. She's loud, obnoxious, and ready to ruin someone's day. But what happens when she picks the wrong people to mess with? Today's story dives into a jaw-dropping encounter that starts with bullying and ends with an unforgettable twist. You'll meet a couple who stand their ground, strangers who band together, and one Karen who learns the hard way that not everyone will put up with her antics. Stick around to see how this shocking moment unfolds and why instant karma was served in the most satisfying way. You won't believe how quickly things turned around. Ready to see justice in action? Let's dive in. The story begins with Sarah and James, a kind-hearted couple out for a peaceful afternoon walk. They were enjoying the fresh air and the cheerful energy of the park when Karen appeared out of nowhere. Dressed in oversized sunglasses and a scowl, she immediately zeroed in on them, accusing them of taking up too much space on the pathway. Her voice was sharp, her tone condescending, and she seemed determined to make a scene. What Karen didn't realize was that nearby, a small group of people had stopped to watch. These weren't just passive bystanders, they were everyday folks who had seen enough of this kind of behavior. Sarah and James tried to remain calm, politely explaining themselves, but Karen's accusations only grew louder and more ridiculous. The air grew tense as onlookers exchanged glances. What would Hey Karen hesitated for a moment, clearly taken aback by Margaret's confident tone, but quickly regained her composure. "Yes, there's a problem," Karen snapped, pointing at Sarah and James. "These two are being rude and disrupting everyone's peace." Margaret raised an eyebrow, glancing at the couple, then back at Karen. "From where I'm standing, it looks like they're just minding their own business," she said, her voice steady. Karen's face reddened, but before she could respond, Alex stepped forward, holding up his phone. "Actually, I've been recording everything. Do you want to see what really happened?" The crowd grew quieter, their curiosity piqued. Karen's expression shifted from anger to unease, but she doubled down, accusing Alex of invading her privacy. Meanwhile, Sarah's frustration was growing. "We didn't come here to argue with anyone," she said, her voice tinged with exasperation. Another bystander, a middle-aged man in a baseball cap, chimed in. "Lady, maybe it's time you let this go. Nobody here seems to agree with you." Karen glared at him, but she was starting to lose her grip on the situation. The tension in the air was palpable, and it was clear the standoff wasn't over yet. And next, little did Karen know, the tables were about to turn in a way she never expected. Karen's voice grew louder as she tried to defend herself. "You're all just ganging up on me," she shouted, her arms flailing in frustration. The crowd around her was no longer just curious, they were visibly annoyed. Alex, still holding his phone, calmly replied, "We're not ganging up on you. We're standing up for what's right." Sarah and James exchanged a glance, their patience wearing thin but still trying to stay composed. "We really don't want this to escalate," James said, his tone firm yet polite. Karen scoffed, stepping closer to him. "Oh, don't act like the victim now," she sneered. The crowd gasped at her audacity, and Margaret shook her head in disbelief. From the corner of the park, a security guard had started making his way over. A young boy, tugging at his mother's sleeve, whispered, "Is she in trouble?" The mother nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Karen noticed the guard approaching but pretended not to care. Instead, she turned to Margaret. "And who even asked you to get involved?" Margaret smiled faintly. "I don't need an invitation to stand up for decency," she replied. The energy in the park was electric. Everyone could feel the moment building towards something big. All eyes were on Karen, Sarah, and James, and it was clear something was about to give. Just as the security guard reached the edge of the crowd, another unexpected twist unfolded. A jogger out of breath and holding a leash with an energetic golden retriever stepped into the circle. "Wait a second," she said, pointing at Karen. "Isn't that the same woman who caused a scene at the coffee shop last week?" The crowd murmured, and a few people nodded in recognition. Karen's face turned pale for a moment before she quickly recovered, waving dismissively. "I don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, but the jogger wasn't backing down. "Oh, I remember you clearly. You were yelling at the barista for no reason and then stormed out when people called you out." The murmurs grew louder as the crowd started piecing together a pattern. Karen tried to regain control of the situation. "They're all ganging up on me for no reason," she insisted, her voice shaking. But her usual tactics weren't working. Margaret crossed her arms, Alex held his phone steady, and the jogger stood firm. Sarah, who had stayed quiet for most of this, finally spoke up. "Karen, maybe it's time you take a look at how you're treating people. All we wanted was a peaceful walk, but you turned it into this." Her words hung in the air, resonating with the crowd. Karen's grip on the narrative was slipping fast, and the tension was at its breaking point. The security guard raised a hand, signaling for calm as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Karen firmly, "it seems there's a history here, and this situation is escalating unnecessarily. Let's step aside and talk this through." But Karen wasn't ready to give up. "You're all against me. This is harassment," she explained, her voice cracking. Before she could say more, Alex spoke up, his phone still recording. "Karen, everyone here has witnessed what happened. Maybe it's time to stop digging yourself into a deeper hole." Just then, a young girl ran up from behind the jogger, tugging her sleeve. "Mom, isn't that the lady who yelled at us last time?" The jogger froze, glancing at her daughter, then back at Karen. The crowd erupted in whispers, and Karen's face turned bright red. Margaret, calm and composed, stepped forward again. "Karen, it's clear, this isn't just about today. Maybe it's time to reflect on how you're treating others," she said gently but firmly. The security guard nodded in agreement, his posture steady. As Karen stood there, the weight of the moment finally seemed to hit her. She looked around, realizing she had lost the crowd and her own defense. Without another word, she turned and walked briskly away, her head down. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving Sarah, James, and the others relieved but reflective. As they began to move on, Alex put his phone away, saying, "This video's going to remind people that standing up to bullies matters." But just as everyone thought it was over, Margaret chuckled softly. "You know," she said to Sarah, "I used to be a lot like her. Change doesn't happen overnight." The group exchanged surprised glances, and Sarah smiled. Well, maybe today planted a seed. With that, the park returned to its usual calm, but the story would leave a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. As the park settled back into its peaceful rhythm, Sarah and James sat on a nearby bench, taking a moment to breathe. "That was something else," James said, shaking his head. Sarah nodded, her thoughts still lingering on Margaret's unexpected comment. Alex walked by, giving them a thumbs up. "You two handled that with a lot of grace," he said, smiling. Not everyone would have stayed so calm. The jogger and her daughter waved goodbye as they headed off, their golden retriever wagging its tail energetically. Margaret, now back at the pond, tossed breadcrumbs to the ducks and gave Sarah a knowing smile. It was a small moment of connection, but it carried a powerful message. As Sarah and James left the park hand in hand, they couldn't help but reflect on how one moment of kindness and composure could ripple out, bringing strangers together and standing up against negativity.